live streams on about 10 different platforms plus TikTok. And of course, the flagship station still is YouTube. But trying to diversify.
Right.
So Michael Schmidt is with us. Thank you for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz live Monday through Friday, 12 to 1 p.m. We also take phone calls, 617-396-4958, 617-396-4958. Michael is a columnist with Politicrossing. He's got a column up, his latest being Charting a Course to History's Dead End. So, Michael, let's go right to that. You are comparing and contrasting the political and philosophical orientation of the previous administration, the Trump administration, to the Biden administration. In a nutshell, if you had to use, I don't mean to put you on a spot here, but if you had to use two terms that would describe each, what would they be?
Oh, I would say the Trump administration, I think, engaged very much in a foreign policy process, much like the Reagan administration, where it was peace through strength, by working on building up the military, by engaging and not appeasing our enemies, but understanding who the enemies were and engaging them through a little more aggressive foreign policy, and also backing up our allies, letting our allies know that, hey, we got your back, whether that was Israel, whether that was Taiwan, and China. That whole ordeal that's going on over there. Just a matter of taking a foreign policy approach where everybody kind of knows where you stand, because the previous administration, the Obama administration, 8 years would be what I would call basically appeasement, and it was people that were generally our allies were miffed by the Obama administration and put aside. And people that were rogue nations that you would have thought would be dealt with on a much more harsher level, they basically cozied up to, whether it was Iran, whether it was China, whether it was Russia, and whether it was Islamic terrorism. I mean, you look at what happened with Islamic terrorism during the 8 years of Obama. I mean, look at how many terrorist attacks there were, and maybe my memory is short, and maybe you can help me out, but I don't remember any Islamic terrorist real incidents during the 4 years of Trump.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, I would describe the difference as that Trump is a nationalist and a populist, whereas Obama, slip of the tongue, same difference, I suppose.
Yes.
Biden is an internationalist and a liberal.
Yes.
And by nationalist, I mean that he was putting the interests of his nation first, asking other nations to put the interests of their nations first, because the nation state is a progressive idea. And that didn't mean that he was not engaging with the rest of the world. He was, from a position, as you say, with Reagan's doctrine of peace through strength. And the result was that there were no wars. There was a de-escalation of American engagement in Afghanistan and Iraq. There was a move toward getting NATO allies to pay for their own defense. After all, World War II has now been over for almost a century. And there was an improvement with the relations with North Korea, not a diplomatic relation, but at least you'll note they stopped with the missile testing during his years, except maybe in the very first months. And generally speaking, a strengthened position in terms of trade with China for sure, standing up to Chinese aggression, and yet not in a sense of having a war. Whereas with Obama, or Biden, I should say, it's back to the old regressive international, perpetual war policy for perpetual peace that was laid out by historian Charles Austin Beard in the 1920s in his book entitled Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace. That's been the American doctrine since then. And we're back to that. America basically serving as a kind of a tool of a world order, what they're now calling the Great Reset. And it's not good for sovereignty. It's not good for the future of the citizen. And as far as like the populism goes, he stood for localism. He stood for limited government. He stood for the sovereign right of the citizen under God being predominantly focused on the individual under God, and that the state would be there to protect, preserve, and defend those rights. That is the American political philosophy. Rights come from the creator and not the state. Whereas with Biden, he's a liberal, and it's essentially the state grants rights. The state acts as a kind of like the divine right of kings. They edict, they send down executive orders. There's no input from the people with regard to the types of laws that we are going to have to live under through our elected representatives. I mean, he issued over 50 executive orders. As you say, in the first month of office, I think that Trump probably issued 5, maybe at most. Even Obama didn't issue that many. And so you have essentially rule by decree. And, there's nothing, not a word barely said about it in the media, because they basically put him in power.
Yeah. Well, and my article was, I wanted to do a foreign policy piece because as you know, with my writing, I try to use history as a guide, and very much, you can, whether you say history repeats itself or not, I mean, that's open for debate, and we can have a debate on that. But it definitely, you can find parallels, and I think we can find a parallel between 1930s Germany and modern day China and the path that we're going down. And really the point of my piece was, do we want to go down that path again? Do we want to do what Europe did and what Neville Chamberlain did, and appease a growing threat to the world? And, if we go down that path again, then we push ourselves to the brink of a possible World War III. And I don't think anybody wants that, especially after what's going on with this whole virus mess. And, the world is anybody, depending no matter what your opinion was of Donald Trump, I don't think you can have an argument to say that the last 4 years under the Trump administration have been a relatively peaceful 4 years. I think the world is
completely peaceful. I mean,
yeah,
maybe he allowed a bomb here and there, which was very targeted against a specific enemy that was trying to kill us. But, you mentioned, you make a parallel historically between the early days of Nazi Germany and what's going on today, and certainly what's going on in China. And by the way, the Chinese are genociding the Uyghurs, the Muslim Uyghurs.
Yeah.
And apparently, when Obama's press secretary, or I should say Biden, why do I keep saying that?
Well, they are one and the same, and that's and
basically we've returned.
We have,
that when she was asked about this, she said, "Well, we're not going to interfere in the cultural
norms."
Thank you, of China. First of all, that is a viciously anti-Chinese statement, because China has 1,000-year civilization that is one of the great civilizations of history. They do not have a history of genociding people.
Right.
They generally, like any history, it's not perfect, but for the most part, they have not been aggressive toward other peoples. And that this is a communist legacy, not a Chinese legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that they would now turn a blind eye to the communist Chinese, who are pouring who knows how much money into democratic coffers, and who are basically corrupting American politics, is absolutely aiding and abetting genocide. We have to name it for what it is.
Oh yeah.
Now, as far as the business of comparing, these early days to the Nazis, we can't say that anymore, because we saw, for example, that this actress, Gina Carano, I think her name is.
Yes.
Yep. She made similar comments in a tweet, and she's now been fired from her job at Disney. So, which in a way almost confirms and reinforces exactly what she's talking about and what we're talking about right now. You have a level of censorship now where you can't make these sorts of comparisons. And by the way, when we say that we're moving toward a more national socialist type system, that doesn't mean, swastikas and, it's not anti-Semitism and concentration camps.
Although anti-Semitism is clearly on a rise, I mean, you have to be almost blind not to see it. So.
Oh yeah, and I'm having Rabbi Aria Sparrow come on with me to talk about that. But the point is that I don't think anyone's accusing, Biden or this of that. That's not the issue. That was a very specific thing.
Right.
But we're talking more philosophically of the idea of a national socialist system where you have an oligarchy that is working hand in glove with monopolistic corporations and big tech. That's fascism. That's Nazism with a small n. It's not Nazism with brown shirts and armbands.
Well,
you have to get beyond those images and just talk about what it is.
Well, and look at it this way, Charles. I mean, it's basically a one-party rule. And if you look at what's going on with this HR 1 that Congress is looking to, Nancy Pelosi brought this up 2 years ago, and it's basically a Democrat power grab. And so, in essence, I mean, what they want to do is they want to stay in power forever and not have any opposition. And so that's what we're looking at.
That's not
when we talk about a national socialist system, we're talking about a one-party big government system, and that would be under the Democrat Party, And
now, Michael, talk a little bit about HR 1. What is the deal with that? Because I mean, I've heard that that's going to essentially, and we have to be careful again because this is YouTube.
Right.
That's going to codify, let's just say, the institution of election irregularities.
There is so much.
Let's tread carefully on this subject because in this atmosphere, we cannot talk about the last election too explicitly.
Well,
I think people know what I'm getting at, though.
Yeah, no, I know, I understand, Charles. No, the HR 1 has so much what I would term crap in there that it is just beyond. I would implore people, as long as I got a minute, call your senators because Congress, it's going to go through Congress, it's going to pass Congress, and it's going to end up going to the Senate. So I don't care who your senator is, whether it's Republican or Democrat, call your senator and tell them vote no on HR 1 when it comes up, because I know that if you're in West Virginia or if you're in Arizona with Sinema, West Virginia with Manchin, and also Montana with Tester, by golly, get on the phone and holler at, don't be rude, but call up their offices and talk to them and say, hey, I'm watching and this bill needs to be voted down.
Yeah. And even if it might seem like a waste of your breath, if you're here in Massachusetts, call Elizabeth Warren.
Well, yeah, I mean, and it doesn't matter. I mean, at this
let
point,
them know that you're out there.
Yeah. I think the more pressure, the more they hear from people that's saying, hey, you know what, we're watching and we're on the air and we're gonna hold you accountable. And but HR 1 has just a plethora of bad stuff in here. We're talking about allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to register to vote. They're talking about by
the way, isn't that something that has to be done by an amendment? Like there was a constitutional amendment that passed in 1969, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. They can't just do that by fiat. There has to be, that is a fundamental change in law. You cannot, Congress doesn't even have the power to do that. That has to be done by amendment, my understanding.
Yeah, they want to also mandate a 14 or 15-day mandatory before 2 weeks before election day. Basically have it an election, almost an election month. where you can come and vote. There's going to be no purging of rolls. If anybody makes an
So what
attempt,
happens if there's no, first of all, that's an interference in the states. The state legislators have the only
they have
constitutional power, the plenary power
yes,
to make election laws. So
yeah.
that should be challenged. But if they're saying there's to be no purging of rolls, then what do you do when you have people in the rolls who have either passed away or they've moved out of state
Yep.
or they are, for whatever reason, no longer citizens of that district? I mean, are their names just to be there? And if so, why?
No, and as a matter of fact, if anybody does try to challenge anything, they face a possibility of legal ramifications against them as well.
Well, I just wonder how logically they explain that. I mean,
Again,
that
I
to
don't
me,
know, but
isn't it the function of a local clerk
it
and
is.
local to make sure, for example, that everybody that's collecting Social Security, everyone that's collecting COVID assistance,
Yep.
we know that apparently there's been billions of dollars in COVID assistance that have gone to fraud, wrong. I mean, that's called, forensic audit. That's fraud protection. I mean, the Social Security Agency actually has, I actually interviewed someone off the record who works for them, and they look at potential Social Security fraud.
Mhm.
And they find cases where they research and there's some kind of an anomaly going on.
Mhm.
And they find out that someone was drawing a Social Security check who either didn't exist or they were not entitled to it.
Mhm.
Why would the voting rolls be any different? If someone is not any longer a person in that district, why would they? They're saying now, oh, you have to leave them there? For what
Mhm.
reason? Why would you leave someone's name on a voting list if they are no longer alive or if they're no longer living in that district?
I think you
I
would
want to know
the
the answer to that question. And you need to call your state senator, your state rep, and say, don't let the legislature get involved in this, and call your US House member and senator and say, I want a simple answer to a simple question. Under not only law and custom, but under common sense, why would we want our local voter rolls to have people on the list who are no longer there? They no longer exist. They passed away.
Right.
It's a simple question
Yep.
that needs a simple answer.
Yep. This bill also outlaws voter ID. It makes voter ID
Which,
illegal.
if anything, that we should have the opposite right now.
Correct.
We should have. I mean, last October, Pelosi wanted to pass a stimulus bill that included, I think it was like billions of dollars toward, quote, voter reform.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know who was getting that money or what they were trying to do, but what we could say is that a small portion of that money could go toward a program that would provide free voter ID to the voter.
Right.
I mean, people, I agree that people shouldn't pay for it,
Right.
that it should be easy to get. But just like you have to get a driver's license, there is nothing wrong with getting voter ID. But the marketing of this is that somehow having a voter ID means that you have something against Black men and women. You've got something against minorities, which itself is profoundly racist, because they're suggesting that someone who is Black or somebody who is a person of color, that they're too stupid to get an ID. I mean, what are they saying?
Mm-hmm.
And if they do believe that, then why don't they make an effort to help people get IDs if that be the case? Right? I mean, when someone applies for example, a welfare benefit, or when someone applies for any government benefit, why not at that point issue them an ID? I mean, a voter ID, so show some kind of proof of residence. I mean, this isn't that difficult.
No.
And the whole thing is, it was cooked up by this phony organization called the Brennan Institute, the Brennan Center for the Constitution, whatever they call it. They gave it some nice sounding name. Founded by and financed by George Soros. It's a turf group. And they came out with this phony study which showed that voter ID is racist. It's completely bogus. We should get someone who is a major in statistics. I'm actually studying statistics right now at a college, and it's not easy for me at my age. But I mean, I appreciate the value of it.
Right.
You need some statisticians who know how to essentially distribute data and then interpret it to find out exactly whether or not this research study by the Brennan Institute is true. We need them to go into it and take a look.
Well, you need to ask then, representatives and say, okay, well, then is it racist that I have to show an ID at the public library to get a library card?
Of course, it's
Is
absurd.
it racist to show an ID in order to buy alcohol at an alcohol store? Is it racist to show an ID to get cigarettes?
Well, I mean, the whole premise of it is bogus.
Yeah.
Black people and brown people and Asians and everyone else are perfectly just as capable of getting an ID as white people. I mean, this is just false.
Yep.
And if someone is having a problem getting an ID, then sure, of course, I don't think it happens, but if it does, it's an outlier, as they say in statistics.
Right.
Then they can get help.
Yep.
It's that simple.
Yep.
I mean, this is ridiculous. So, but they want to essentially ban that.
Yes.
So we're never going to have another free election. We're never going to have another honest election.
No, they call HR 1 For the People Act, but I would rename it For the Democratic Party Act, because in essence, that's what it is. It's a raw power grab is what it is.
It's for these hacks who are paying for vote counters, like what apparently Zuckerberg did, and other people to go into and do things we can't talk about right now because this is YouTube.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, it's institutionalizing what we're talking about in terms of the philosophy that's going on here.
Yes. Yeah.
So
HR 1 cuts really right to the chase of what we were talking about as far as a one-party system and really, trying to solidify their power. So. Yeah.
Right. So your article is on Politicrossing.
Yes.
Which is it's this new politics website which looks at kind of an intersection of politics and faith. The article is entitled "Charting a Course to History's Dead End," where you take a look at historic antecedents as a way of looking at American policy now, both foreign and domestic. We've talked a little bit about the foreign policy. Appeasing the communist Chinese is the big one, and turning a blind eye on the Uyghurs, which is something that Democrats, this isn't new. I mean, Jimmy Carter turned a blind eye on the Cambodian genocide, right? I mean, Clinton turned a blind eye on the Rwandan genocide. So we're not talking about, we could even say that FDR ignored the Holocaust.
Oh, yeah.
He had information in front of him. He decided not to mention it.
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess that this isn't a new thing.
No.
This is history repeating itself.
Yeah, very much so. And I wanted to look at it from a foreign policy standpoint, and I kind of do it more in a broader sense, because weakness invites aggression, and we've seen it throughout the course of history. And so and now, whether or not your enemy, whether or not you actually are really weak, or your enemy perceives you as being weak, it really doesn't much matter. If that, the old saying is perception is reality, right? So if they perceive you as being weak, then they will take advantage of you. And the point of my piece was really to try to let people understand that we're going back down a road again that we don't want to be going back down. We're making the world a much more dangerous place than we need to. By charting a course on these particular policies that history has showed us has failed, we're beating our heads against a brick wall again. But yet you have to look at who the presidents surround themselves with. And if you look, a lot of Biden's people that he has in his administration are all a lot of former Obama acolytes.
Oh yeah, they're all. I mean, unfortunately, Trump also brought in a couple of real winners. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, that's one of the criticisms. He didn't take a harder look at some of the people that he surrounded himself with, and many of them were not loyal to the principles that he was elected to try to implement. But in the case of Biden, I don't know if it's an issue of loyalty. They all are on the same page.
They're all on the same page.
Yeah, right. So we have, we also have, and this is something that you've commented on, what I would describe as a culture kampf in this
Hmm.
country right now.
Yep.
The culture kampf, of course, happened in Germany in the late 19th century under Bismarck, when essentially the Catholic Church was purged
Hmm.
in Germany.
Hmm.
Um, Priests were forced out of the country. There were people who were arrested. There was a crackdown on, in the broader sense, on faith, and a move more toward a socialistic system under Bismarck, a sort of a strong, in a way, it was the first National Socialist movement
Hmm.
in Germany,
Yeah.
where you had this strong imperial state that was based on Hegelian models and
Hmm.
also on Nietzsche. The idea of the will
Right.
as being the primary force in life. And there was also this German thinker, Oswald Spengler, who talked about, oh, he's English, I think, who talked about the nation state as literally having a life, like
Right.
a birth, an
Hmm.
adolescence, a
Hmm.
growth, then a climax, and then a decline and a death.
Hmm.
And that the state became a living organism that people would just be appendages of. In other words, the rights would not come from the creator, which is the American philosophy of government.
Right.
Rights would come from the state, and that the state itself was a living organism, and that we were all just a part of it.
Hmm.
And I think we're undergoing something like that now. It's an American version of a culture kampf.
Yeah, I wrote, and we talked about it a few weeks ago, but the American version of a cultural revolution, and kind of going back to Mao's cultural revolution in China, and
Yes.
you can see very, very similar mechanisms at play here in America. Look at what's been happening. I mean, what was news the other day about Dr. Seuss books?
Yeah, right. They books are now, and in fact, I saw a little something from, I think, the Epoch Times, that Amazon is now quietly beginning to censor books
Mm,
that they think might have said something either, against something that could be mildly viewed as racist,
mm,
or something that's against the trans movement. Let's be
mhm.
careful here. This is YouTube.
Oh, I know.
We can't talk about certain taboo subjects, but the point I'm making here is that there is an informal form of a culture comp. There's going to be a
Mhm.
carving and a channeling
Yes.
of a certain way of communicating and thinking,
Mhm.
very similar to communist China.
Oh, yeah.
Big tech is very influenced by communist China. I think it was George Gilder. He's a great philosopher, American thinker. He's written many books, and he's written extensively on both China and on big tech. And I heard him give an interview recently where he said that China has a social score,
Mhm.
that if you don't have a high social score, you don't get privileges from the state. You can't travel,
Correct.
you can't buy certain things,
Mhm.
you have more intense laws on you. And that he said that we're going to be seeing a move toward this in this country, because companies like Google, and I don't want to get specific here,
Yep.
they have capitulated to the Chinese model, mainly for money. They want to do business in China.
Mhm.
Same thing with Hollywood.
Yep.
Some of the movies they make, they don't even release them here. They just go
Same
right
thing with
to
the
Trump.
NBA. Yeah.
The NBA, I think, was it one of the owners criticized,
Mhm.
said some tweets mildly supportive of the
General manager, I
rebellion, and
believe.
yeah,
Mhm.
that's right, in
Yes.
Hong Kong. You covered that.
Yeah.
And you had people like LeBron James and others all of a sudden get up and say, oh, this is
Mhm.
terrible. So
Mhm.
you have, it's going to hurt our business to
Mhm.
criticize China. So you have this being transferred to America. At the time that I heard Gilder say this, and this is several years ago, this is before Trump was president, this is before anything.
Mhm.
And I was like, oh, that's incredible. I don't think that could ever happen in America.
Hmm.
That was my reaction.
Mhm.
But, a lot of things that we never thought would happen here are happening.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, we've talked about it in the past on our podcast interviews, but I mean, do you think 15, 20 years ago that people would have given up their rights so freely, their freedom and liberty for a virus? I would say
Right.
no, you know,
Oh,
but
I mean, even, that's interesting because look, I mean, I'm terrified of this virus and I think that we have to take precautions. But that's different than having these kinds of laws that come in. And yeah, I mean, that was, you take a look at, um, I don't think like in Europe, Germany never shut down their schools.
yeah,
Sweden never even,
no,
and the Netherlands, they didn't have masks.
yeah,
I mean, and I don't know if their rates are higher or lower
yeah.
for that. I'm not here saying don't wear these things, don't do these things. I do it.
Well, no, I mean, and I think my point, overall point, is the fact that, in American society, we've always felt that the individual has a choice of how to live their life. It's that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and every person chooses how they go about doing that. What we are seeing now over the last, year and a half is we're seeing that whole model being pushed away, and people are being almost numbed or trained to be re-educated to the sense that, okay, well, the state tells me I've got to wear a mask, then I guess I'll just go and wear a mask. And people are being trained to do that. So even when these mask mandates go away, I wonder what percentage of the American population are still going to be out every day wearing a mask, no matter where they are,
Oh, I
because
think a lot of people.
they've been trained now to, and that's the point I'm trying to make, is we're going away from what our founding fathers, built, and
Yeah.
we're going more towards a statist, communist type regime model, totalitarian model, and that's where the red flags are. That's where we need to wake up a little bit and understand and try to move this course back towards our founding fathers, because if we don't, we're running out of time, to be honest with you, Charles.
No, I mean, I think so. And you talk about like, you know, when you have a thing like the pandemic, I mean, it changes a culture.
Mhm,
Any major event does.
mhm,
And I mean, my own doctor, I go in for my annual checkup, and she kind of thinks like I do on these things. And she said to me, I think that several of my patients are never going to stop with masks. It doesn't matter. They're never going to come out of the house. I mean, they're like,
they're living
it
in a
just,
state of fear.
yeah. And people have, are in this mindset. And, you're familiar, of course, with the Communist Manifesto. I think we've talked
Mhm,
about this. And
mhm,
one of the planks of the manifesto and one of the strategies for implementing socialism was to examine a particular society that would be targeted, figure out what their weaknesses are, what their wedge politics are,
mhm,
and then exacerbate those, go in and create divisions. I mean, everyone knows that this is what Russia did in this country, even recently. They
mhm,
go in and they start to agitate. Apparently, there was a lot of Russian agitation around the George Floyd uh, murder and killing,
mhm,
I should say,
mhm.
to create division. And they view the best way to divide the United States and weaken our fabric and our cohesion is by race agitation,
Right.
because we are a multiracial country, one of the few in the world. And naturally, there is some racial tensions like there would be when anytime you have different people of different ethnic, racial, religious backgrounds living together, you're going to have differences and there's going to at times be tensions.
Mhm.
But the idea is to exacerbate those, whereas for the most part, we are cohesive as Americans,
Right.
and to try to create more division than we need to have. And I would suggest that racial divisions in this country have weakened greatly, particularly
Mhm,
since World War II. The
mhm,
integration of the army, the
mhm.
integration of sports,
Yeah.
the integration of business. Black people have gone up, they've become more middle class. You have a weakening of the economic disparities. You have the
Mhm,
removal of the, Jim Crow laws and other heinous things.
mhm,
You have the Civil Rights Act. These things have led to an improvement,
mhm.
but yet they are going back in with a microscope, and they're trying to push a new racism. Um,
Yeah.
I heard Megan Kelly talk about this. She was on with Bill Maher. I like to watch him once in a while.
Mhm.
And she said, look, my kids, my two children are in New York City schools. Yes, they're liberal. I understand that, even though I'm right of center, that's not a problem. But they're getting this kind of micro education about that white people are evil and that,
Mhm.
have you ever considered being transsexual? I mean, again, we can't go into that. But I
Mhm.
mean, just kind of this kind of woke education
Yeah.
that is creating unnecessary conflict and division and within young people. You were talking about elementary schools. And I think that they're trying to germinate more race division,
Mhm.
more sex division, more any division they can come up with.
I think you
So
and I
that,
talked about this last time, Charles, and with the American version of of a cultural revolution, in the sense that, I call it neo-Marxism, because it's almost a twist on the Marxist uh, ideology, in the sense that Marxism is basically a class struggle, right? It's rich versus
right,
poor. It's the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. And you still see that. I mean, you look at your senator there and her brand new
right.
wealth tax that she's proposing. Okay,
Oh yeah,
uh,
sure.
so you still see that struggle is there, but I think more so it's this neo-Marxist, what I call it, in the sense that they're using race, gender, equality, equity. They're taking word. It's that wordplay issue again, where they're taking words and they're controlling what the words mean. They're changing the meanings of words to fit their ideology and to cause that division. And if you look back to the Obama years, I think that's where it started. I mean, Obama was really his whole career in Chicago was as a community organizer. Okay, so and you can see now as he's gotten back out of office, he's doing that community organizing again. He's talking about reparations. He's talking about, I mean, that's 160 years ago, and yet he's trying to bring this all back again, and it's all trying to cut away and eat away at the foundations of America. And again, the 1619 project, all of this stuff is trying to cut away at the foundations of our country. And like Mark said, if you start breaking away and get people to forget about their foundations, and you tear that away from people, you can rebuild a new utopian society, if you will.
Right. Well, sure. I mean, you create the synthesis and the antithesis
They're going to rewrite history, is what they're
together.
trying to do. So,
And look, there is a dialectic, of course, that's natural. We're not talking about that. We're talking about them isolating certain issues and then kind of through social engineering,
right.
crashing them together in order to weaken the fabric of the whole. And then they emerge as the great, man on the white horse to rescue us. That we've arrived. It's like Mighty Mouse. Here I come to save the day, right?
Right.
So they march in, and then they essentially implement a stronger, more centralized
Yes.
thing. I mean, this is their idea of progress. And of course, in nature, the natural theory, so-called natural, is Darwin. The idea that
Survival of the
out
fittest.
of a species pops a new species that's superior.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, this is exactly what they're up to. And I mean, I don't think it started with Obama. It's
No, but I think if you look at the Obama years, and you look particularly, you look at his interactions with what happened with down in Florida with the I forget the name of the kid who was killed by George.
Oh, you mean Trayvon Martin?
Trayvon Martin, and he said,
right.
It was innocuous, but he said, "Hey, if I had a boy, a son, he would look like Trayvon." Right. Again, innocuous, but enough to interject, into that. You had the incident with his former professor, Henry Louis Gates, I believe it was, up there in Cambridge. And he, how often does a president interject himself into a local matter like that and saying, "Hey, I don't know what happened with the police there, but something just,
something was wrong." And by the way, a little sidebar, I like Gates's program, and I think he's decent. However, he recently said something that's a little interesting. He said that the Armenian genocide is being exaggerated by people who have something against Muslims. Just thought I'd toss that out.
Right.
But
But you see my point, and then you go over to you go over to the Baltimore situation, and then you go over to Missouri, to the St. Louis area there, and Ferguson, and how he interjected himself in each one of those instances, and
Flames of racism.
and again, it was just a matter of mixing and stirring the pot enough to agitate and create that dissension between minorities and police, between minorities and whites, and I mean,
and then to stand back and watch everybody.
You can see a clear, at least a clear agenda of dissension and disturbances that were caused. Maybe not so much through actions, but more so through by words. And when you're a president, it's a bully pulpit, and you kind of your words kind of carry a little bit more meaning. And so that's why when I say that, that's where I'm talking about is kind of that whole sense of direction started, during that administration.
No, exactly, and it's a corrupt kind of agitation. I mean, just briefly, I mean, to use the example of Trayvon Martin incident, they doctored the tape so it would make it look like it was racially motivated, literally by shopping out certain words and isolating other words.
Mm-hmm.
And then we find out that the guy that did it was not white. And, racism might have had something to do with it, but it was amplified in a way that was, I think we should note it was just before the 2012 election.
Mm-hmm.
And, the idea was to, I think, damage Republicans and damage Mitt Romney.
Mm-hmm.
This is what Republicans, they want to, they're gun crazy, and, the stand and deliver and all this. And it was entirely a political ploy.
Mm-hmm.
And likewise with other events. So that doesn't mean that it can't. By the way, when President Trump came out with a very good package of police reform, it was rejected by people like my own Congresswoman here, Ayanna Pressley,
mm-hmm.
and Democrats, because they didn't want Trump to look good.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't want to have Trump to have that on his record.
Mm-hmm.
So they stopped that. They also stopped humanitarian aid to children coming over the border from Mexico, because again, that would make Trump look good.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that one did pass, so we don't now, of course, we have the Biden cages, but that's a whole different subject.
That's a whole
anyway. So Michael, let my listeners and viewers know where they can read your articles and your newsletter.
Yep. You can find me at politicrossing.com. I am contributing articles, usually about one article a week, and ranges from politics to some on faith and foreign policy, just a variety of different subjects, depending what pops in my head. You can find me on LinkedIn. Just look up Michael Schmidt, and you can connect with me on there. I post a lot of my articles and stuff on there as well to read. You can find me on Twitter at BuckyBoyMike. I've got quite a bit of material that I tweet out on a daily basis, news stories, and you can follow my stuff there. And then, of course, there's my blog that I've written for the last 5 years, conservativethinker.net.
Right.
I've got 90 plus pieces that you can peruse, and a plethora of good stuff to read there and share. So.
Excellent. And of course, you're a regular on this program.
Yes. I appreciate you having me as always. I enjoy our discussion. Yes.
Always a pleasure. And you've got, so politicrossing.com is your newest information and opinion blog.
Yep.
And so excellent, Mike.